All right, we're going to get started here. Hello, my name is Colton Fagundis. I'm with the American Sustainable Business Council. I'm a policy manager here. You are on the webinar for financing water infrastructure with the National Infrastructure Bank Coalition. This is a collaboration between our two organizations as well as the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance. And today we'll be covering a variety of different topics that's related to the National Infrastructure Bank, financing for water infrastructure, green stormwater infrastructure, and how we can better collaborate moving forward and bring the business case to advocating for these issues. So ASBC, for those of you that aren't aware of us, we are a organization serving over 250,000 businesses represented within our membership. We advocate for policy change around a variety of different issues like infrastructure, sustainable agriculture, climate change, and race and equity. In my name, Colton Fagundis, I will be presenting today on the business case for water infrastructure. Actually, we're gonna, sorry, that was reversed. We're gonna start with Alfeka Mutardi, who is from the National Infrastructure Bank Coalition, macroeconomist, worked for the International Monetary Fund for several years, and she's going to give the overview of the National Infrastructure Bank, including an overview of the full funding and financing gap for water infrastructure and water management, and covering some other infrastructure issues as well. Then we're going to finish with Seth Brown from Storm and Stream Solutions and also the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance, and he will be covering green stormwater infrastructure, potential for green stormwater infrastructure, and barriers to its implementation. So without further ado, I'm going to let Alfeka please share your screen. I'll stop sharing mine.
Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be with all of you today. My name is Alfeka Mutardi, and I'm a macroeconomist with the Coalition for a National Infrastructure Bank. And what we have been working on for a few years now is to find a way to pay for all of our infrastructure needs. Currently, we have a long-term problem funding infrastructure. And then with this COVID economy shutdown, we have a very severe acute problem for funding infrastructure and also for putting people back to work. So what this bank does is aim to cover both of those needs. So let me start with what the need is. And you could look at it best from asking ourselves, how much have we spent on infrastructure over time? The share has been falling off quite considerably. Of total spending on infrastructure in the United States, spending has fallen from 4% of GDP in the 1960s down to 2.3% of GDP today. So just to give you a comparison of what other parts of the world are doing, for example, China is spending 8% of its GDP on infrastructure, and Europe about 5% of GDP. And that's reflected in really some astounding improvements in their overall infrastructure, and including the fact that they've been able to finance and build really a large network of high-speed rail, which we're going to cover. So then if you look at the total spending on infrastructure, the share of who's spending what, you'll find that the federal government share has also fallen way off. Today, the federal funds pay for about 28% of all of our infrastructure. The large portion of the remaining gap has been filled by state and local governments under their normal processes of financing infrastructure. And you'll see that the fall off for water infrastructure has been even much more severe than that. So today, federal funds pay for only 4% of water infrastructure. That's down from 31% in 1977. And keep in mind that this period in the 70s was when the Nixon administration and Congress passed the Clean Water Act, and they set up the Environmental Protection Agency. And then it became the fact that this agency now had regulatory control over water infrastructure and air pollution as well, and then could fine utilities if they weren't if they needed to make improvements to bring their water safety up to a given federal standards, and then the federal government gave them money to meet those standards. But over time, the water got cut out of the budget faster than any other infrastructure was being cut out. So the bulk of all this 28% that's going to infrastructure is mostly going to roads as opposed to water. So what we did with our proposal for a national infrastructure bank was to ask ourselves the question, if we were not constrained at all by budgets, how much would we need to fix everything? And what we did was we went to the American Society of Civil Engineers, their 2017 report card, which said to fix roads, bridges, schools, everything that the infrastructure that they track, passenger rail, airports, hazardous waste, and even public parks and recreation, we would need $4.6 trillion over 10 years just to bring it up to a state of good repair. And then they further went on to say that of that $4.6 trillion, they reckoned that about half of it, 2.5 trillion, was already funded. And the normal funding process for infrastructure includes the federal funding part, the state and local finances part, and then also state and local governments might raise money through gas taxes or issue municipal bonds to pay for their infrastructure. So that's everything that's covered under this column. And then anytime the federal government would come up with a new appropriation for infrastructure spending, like the one that they did, that they passed last July, HR 2, to cover 5 years worth of infrastructure spending from the federal government, then that would be covered under this category right here. And so we took HR 2 just to show you a comparison of where the money is going in HR 2. And you'll see that the large majority of it was going for roads and bridges, and only a very small portion was going to water infrastructure.
Sorry,
So,
sorry to interrupt. If
sure.
you're trying to share your screen, we're not able to see it, just so you're aware.
Oh, so let me escape. Let me try again to share. I am not, yes, there we go. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I apologize. So let me backtrack really quickly then. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. What I was saying is that the American Society of Civil Engineers say we need 4.6 trillion over 10 years, of which 2.5 trillion is already funded through the normal means. But their estimate was that in 2017, 2 trillion was not financed whatsoever. Now, that was the 2017 report. We now have, which other speakers are going to refer to, we now have some new estimates from the American Society of Civil Engineers for water and wastewater that were updated in 2020, which now say that the financing gap for water alone is 1.1 trillion. So what we want to do is we want to have a bank that's large enough to cover everything. That way, there won't be any elbowing out of one set of infrastructure as opposed to another. So what you can see from this line is that we now need a $5 trillion to cover all of the infrastructure financing gap identified by the American Society of Civil Engineers. And in addition, we've added in more monies into this bank to cover affordable housing, 720 billion, high-speed rail, 650 billion, and some large water redistribution projects. Now, of all of these lines on this table, water is covered in 3 areas. The first is water and wastewater. That's this line right here. And then in addition, we have dams, levees, waterways, and ports, which cover some water projects right here, but other things as well. So if we're talking about which our later speaker is going to do, if we're talking about stormwater or stormwater systems, which typically are wastewater systems where the stormwater and the wastewater is combined into one delivery piping system that can sometimes overflow. It might come under this line or this line, but this infrastructure bank will definitely cover stormwater and stormwater overflow projects. We want to cover everything that has to do with water infrastructure one way or another, and we want to make sure that we have adequate funding. So what we're going to propose, we have a piece of legislation that was introduced into the Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives in March, HR 6422, to enact this public bank that would cover $4 trillion worth of infrastructure. And what we're going to do now is to propose to the writers of the legislation that we increase the size of the bank to $5 trillion in order to cover especially this new estimation from the engineers for water and wastewater. So that's everything that we're going to cover in the bank. I'd like to briefly explain how this bank works for viewers who are not familiar with a public bank or banking procedures in general. This bank takes its idea from the first Bank of the United States, which was developed by Alexander Hamilton, and there were 3 other iterations of a public bank in the United States through FDR's Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And nearly all of our nation's infrastructure was built by one of these banks. We did not do it on pay-as-you-go through the budget. We actually used a bank like this to fund infrastructure. And this bank is going to operate in the same general manner as the first Bank of the United States. So what it does, I'm going to explain in this little flow chart right here, 3 little sort of circles here. This first circle is how we're going to capitalize the bank. The second circle right here is how the bank will give out a loan. And then this third circle, which I hope is not covered by pictures, but is how the effect that this bank is going to have on the overall macroeconomy and creating jobs and stimulating economic growth. So what we're going to, and I'm operating on the premise on this picture that we're going to lend up to $4 trillion for infrastructure. So to have a public bank, we need kind of 2 things. We need to have a charter, which the legislation does give you a charter, and then we need to have capital in the bank. And instead of taking the capital from the federal budget, what we're going to do is take it from the private sector, people who are holding treasuries as a form of long-term savings. And we want to see if people that are holding those treasuries, there's about 17 trillion out there, and we only need 500 billion to capitalize the bank. If they would be willing to sell us temporarily their treasuries into the bank in exchange for preferred stock in the bank that would pay an extra 2% above what they're earning on their treasuries. That's to entice them to bring them in. We think that that's an enticement mechanism that works very well. When Alexander Hamilton used it, it took him about 1 week to completely capitalize his bank back then at $10 million, which was our first central bank in the United States. So this 2% extra on 500 billion, which is 10 billion a year, will initially come from the federal budget as mandatory spending, but then will be paid back out of the interest earnings from the bank as a dividend back to government. And the reason for configuring the bank this way is so that with respect to the federal budget, this national infrastructure bank is budget neutral, requires no new taxes like a gas tax or anything like that, and creates new debt. Now, the problem with all of the other infrastructure proposals that are around is that if they require spending from the federal budget on a net basis, they're either going to require new taxes or create new federal debt. And right now, we're in a recession. We don't want to add on new taxes. And we also don't want to add too much to federal deficits if we can help it, because we already have a huge debt overhang from the federal government. So this should make this bank sellable, actually something that both Republicans and Democrats can support. And after all, infrastructure has always been a bipartisan support in Congress. So that brings me to the second little circular flow right here of how a loan is taken from the National Infrastructure Bank and where the funds actually come from that the bank is lending. So this bank will, in the main, operate just like a commercial bank when it gives a loan. Actually, the secret sauce here is that anytime anybody comes into a commercial bank for a loan, what the bank does is actually creates a deposit on the spot, and a deposit is money after all, in exchange for the loan, because it puts the loan up as an asset on one side of its books, and then a counter deposit in the borrower's name on the other side of its books, so that its assets remain assets equal liabilities. This is an accounting function of banks. This is the way that the money would be created here in this little flow process right here. Anytime anybody would come in for a National Infrastructure Bank loan request, and they could be anybody from who owns the public infrastructure. This would be states, governments, counties, cities that own schools, roads, transit authorities. Any transit authority or utility would come in on its own steam and ask for a loan request, the same as it does sometimes when it goes to the bond market to raise money as well. But this bank will give loans, infrastructure loans, with full technical assistance at a very low rate of interest, and will sort of look the other way while we're in this recessionary period, because we know that the finances of state and local governments are now in disarray on account of the recession. And the reason that the bank, as a public bank, will do that is because the fastest way out of this economic recession is to get people back to work in great paying jobs and off of social safety net rolls and earning a great wage, and now increasing their disposable income, so that when they are then paying income taxes and there's higher growth in the economy, this will come back around as new economic growth down here. And then that will spur receipts into state and local coffers to repay back loans, and also back to the federal government, which will be a net huge recipient of benefits from this infrastructure bank. So that'll be the greatest, the lowest interest provided around. And then finally, this bank will act as a sort of an organizer of all the infrastructure to make sure that we're doing investments where they're needed the most. Critical areas like choke points on highways that are stopping up freight, dangerous bridges, funding the Gateway Project, where a rail tunnel under the Hudson River is in very, very bad shape. Fixing things like the Brent Spence Bridge that crosses from Ohio into Kentucky, that just caught fire a couple of weeks ago and has been temporarily closed but needs ultimate replacement. 2% of the GDP of the nation goes across that one bridge. So to give you economic examples of things that need to be fixed. And then of course, there's the huge water infrastructure problem. So we can do planning for all of these things, and we expect to cover infrastructure in every single jurisdiction of the United States. And the bank requires that projects that receive loans must pay Davis-Bacon wages. The input into the construction, manufacturing inputs into the construction must buy America only. So all of that will also stimulate economic growth. So here are the overall benefits from this bank, keeping in mind that we're covering not only water infrastructure, but a whole lot of other infrastructure as well. We expect to rebuild crumbling infrastructure in every single jurisdiction in the United States, to have less traffic congestion and CO2 pollution, provide new schools, affordable housing. We think that spending $4 to $5 trillion will create 25 million new jobs, both directly in the construction and indirectly in improvements to the economy. Again, they will pay union level wages, Davis-Bacon wages. and hire from all of the millions of Americans who are now unemployed. This will be the fastest way to get ourselves out of this recession we're currently in. We think that it'll also stimulate small businesses. Buy America only features to the program. We also have a disadvantaged business enterprise program contained within the legislation, and a community development program in there as well. There'll be lots of work for engineers, contractors, suppliers, and other businesses indirectly. The economy will be more productive. We expect that we can get growth. The 10 years prior to the COVID shutdown, economic growth was averaging 1.8% a year. That's very low. So we think that we can get it up to the 5% a year range. And we have quite a number of computer models, including the University of Maryland Inforum model, which was used for the water study and for the electric grid study and for the transportation studies in 2020. And then we think that this will really stimulate federal and state revenues to solve budget problems. And because it's budget neutral, it has a great chance of being passed. So if you would like to read more about this bank proposal, our website is nibcoalition.com. If you have a group of people who are very interested in infrastructure, recognize the problem that the big problem is financing. That's the big problem. We can get ourselves organized to say what we're going to fix and how we're going to fix it, but how to pay for it is the big problem. And this bank pays for everything. So if you would like to organize a group to receive a presentation from our coalition, here is the contact information. What we're doing is we're formulating grassroots efforts all across the United States to support this infrastructure and bring it up to the attention of members of Congress. We're organizing labor unions, civic action groups, council persons from state and local government that are desperate for infrastructure and a way to pay for it in their areas. We're formulating resolutions. We passed a whole lot of these on our webpage. You can see a tab for endorsements to see all of the folks who have already endorsed it. And so we think that this is a successful formula for getting this legislation up. And we've had a lot of momentum, even since the COVID shutdown, we've had a lot of momentum on building this grassroots effort. So if you'd like to join that effort, we would certainly welcome you. Or you can call your member of Congress and simply ask them to pass HR 6422. This is the Capitol Switchboard number. So with that, I'll leave it for the questions and answers. If there was anything that I missed in the presentation, the bottom line here is the way forward to pay for infrastructure at last, and water infrastructure in particular at last, is to have an overarching bank that is large enough to cover everything. Thanks very much for your time and attention.
All right, thank you. I'm going to load up my presentation here. All right. And while I'm doing this, just let everyone know, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function there on your Zoom. And at the end, we're going to allow 15 minutes for questions and answers, but you can go ahead and start putting them in there now. All right. So, again, my name is Colin Fagundis. American Sustainable Business Council will be presenting on the business case for investing in water infrastructure. So this first slide, Alfeka actually went over this already, but here's some of the data that she mentioned earlier, and that was when her presentation wasn't working at the moment. So some of the need for investment in water infrastructure is outlined here, and the federal gap in investment. But what I'm going to be covering mostly today is the business case and the economics, both starting off with some of the same information Alfeka covered earlier within service disruptions and flooding. So, this is mostly failures in wastewater infrastructure and drinking water and provision of service of water, failing pipes and sanitation centers, etc. And how is this going to impact the economy and our businesses? So flooding, production delays, sales losses and damages, and service disruptions if your business is highly dependent on water or wastewater services, and there's a delay in service, or there's leakage and the rates are your rates are going up. This is going to lead to lost sales, increased cost of operations, and this is going to have a ripple effect through the economy. The previous study, Alfecca mentioned it, and I had it on my previous slide here, offers some really good data on this. The Failure to Act report from the Value of Water and Water Campaign and American Civil Society of Engineers. We'll send it out actually in the follow-up, but in the meantime, you can go ahead and look it up. It's a great resource for this kind of information. So again, some of the data here from the issues I was just mentioning, the projections from that report show that service disruptions would lead to business loss of $230 to $5,800 in sales per employee per day. Actually, that's current losses. It depends on what sector you're in and how dependent on water your sector is. But then the projections, 732 billion in lost business sales by 2029 and over 4.5 trillion by 2039. And lost jobs by 2029, 333,000, and by 2039, 636,000. So you can see here the impacts could be rather severe. And again, this is if we were to continue at current projections, current investment levels, our failing water infrastructure and the impacts it's going to have, and the ripple effects that's going to have throughout the economy, both on lost sales and businesses, and then impacts on households and their decreasing ability to purchase goods and services. And then on the reverse side, potential job creation and economic growth from the investment and all of the engineering jobs and the provision of the materials and primary goods for all the different projects. And again, that ripple effect throughout the rest of the economy. They predict there could be a $5.6 trillion in increased business sales by 2039 and around 800,000 jobs created. So I'm also going to cover an area of the business impacts of failing infrastructure, water infrastructure, that isn't really covered in that American Society of Civil Engineers report. And this has to do with the impacts of water pollution. And this is a lot of the work that we do at ASBC in our Clean Water is Good for Business campaign, where we elevate the business case for protecting clean water, protecting watersheds and aquatic ecosystems and so forth. And so we work with a variety of businesses across sectors to elevate that case and advocate for policies, and amongst those including, of course, investments in water infrastructure. And some of the sectors that rely on access to water bodies and clean waterways, of course, commercial fishing, outdoor recreation suppliers, boaters, suppliers for recreational fishing, waterside restaurants, within a lot of communities, highly dependent on whatever their local water body is, whether it be a lake, a river, if they're on the coast. A lot of times their whole entire economy is dependent, or much of their economy is dependent on tourism and people coming to enjoy the various amenities that water body provides. And then even if those businesses aren't directly providing for tourists or servicing recreation, water-based recreation, often if the other businesses feel the impacts, or if the businesses that are more directly dependent on clean water feel the impacts, ripples throughout the rest of the economy. Then of course, in beverage and food manufacturers, and many other sectors are heavily dependent on access to clean water within their production. And if there's rising water pollution, and they're having to purify their water or do extra purification for the water, can raise the costs. For beer, for example, the water pollution can really affect the taste of the beer, the taste and the smell. They say, beer is mostly water. And if they don't have access to a clean water supply, sometimes it just, no matter how many times how well they do purifying it, the taste is not quite the same. I'm actually going to skip this slide because Seth is going to go over it. So just to give a business or case study of the business impacts of water pollution. This is one a community we work with in New Jersey, Lake Hopatcong. Last summer, 2019, they experienced a toxic algae outbreak, and Seth is going to go in this little bit more and what causes these. But nutrient pollution, and in this particular case, it's a lot of urban stormwater runoff that is causing these algae, or causing the pollution that is leading to these algae outbreaks. And so the business we're working with is a boating service company there, and last year they saw their customer base just sort of disappear because no one was coming to the lake. Actually, the beach was closed. Technically, you could still bring boats out on to the lake, of course, but the algae smells. No one really wants to visit the lake if you can't swim in it, and the whole entire town lost much of its summer tourism. And even going into 2020, there was no algae outbreak this year, but there's sort of now this stigma almost attached to the lake. More people remember that this situation last year, and so now it's not on their list of summer places to visit. Hopefully that won't continue moving forward. New Jersey's taking several actions to address some of the causes of these algae outbreaks, but it's happening throughout the state, and it's really affecting some of the local economies there. And again, not just the businesses like the boating company that we work with that are directly servicing the lake, but it ripples throughout the rest of the economy, even affecting gas stations and even like financial service companies and so forth that are, the whole entire economy is interlinked. And this situation is repeated across the whole entire country. Many different cases, I could rattle them off that different businesses, communities we work with, and the point being that clean water is good for business, and water pollution has serious business impacts, and failing water infrastructure is one of the leading causes of water pollution. And Seth is going to go a bit more into that, as well as cover a variety of other topics. So I'm actually just going to cancel this out, Seth, if you want to load up your presentation.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, just wanted to, I was trying to cut out some of my slides just to make use of the time. So let me share my screen, and then okay. Okay, so can you see that? Is that screen share working? Okay, and I will also I'll have my video going too. Okay, so thanks for including me as part of this webinar. I really appreciate it. My name is Seth Brown. I lead the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance, and that's what I'll be speaking about today. So I'm going to quickly go over some stormwater infrastructure issues, and some, so a lot of it has green stormwater infrastructure. There's a differentiation there, but I'm going to quickly go through a lot of information. I'll probably skip through some of it just so we can have time for questions, which is really helpful. So first, I just want to be clear. Oftentimes we talk about the water sector as something we all understand. Most of the time we think of the water sector in terms of drinking water, wastewater. Those are the big dollar, the kind of the longer term or longer history water sector. Stormwater runoff is something that affects us everywhere. It's basically just rainwater that or precipitation of some kind overwhelms the landscape, creates excess, and the water has to go somewhere, so it runs off. Just so we're on the same page and knowing what runoff means and when we say stormwater runoff. And obviously, the more we develop the landscapes, the more runoff we're going to have, generally speaking. So there's both urban runoff and there's agricultural or non-point runoff. Two different things, but they're kind of two sides of the same coin, and they're driven by impervious cover, especially in the urban side. Thinking about urban runoff, EPA calls this the only major growing source of water pollution. And it impacts all these different areas: flooding, ecological impacts. We've got, Colton talked about algal blooms. We'll see a rise of those. There's hundreds of them around the country in coastal areas and now inland areas. We have over half the stream miles in the country do not support healthy populations of aquatic biota. Most of the sediment that goes to the Chesapeake Bay, I'm located in the Washington, D.C. area. Most of the sediment that goes there is associated with stream erosion because of excess stormwater runoff. And of course, we heard about the combined sewer overflows. So that's when water, sanitary flows and drainage or stormwater runoff are in the same system. We have close to, this is a number from 2004, really. It's published in 2006 from EPA. 850 billion gallons of untreated or partially treated stuff that's in our urban waters. So there's a lot of different forms of this, a lot of different impacts. Just to give the context of where we've been in this sector and where we are today. This is information that came from William Ruckelshaus, who just passed away not that long ago. He was the first EPA administrator, and he held that position twice. He was really one of the people who wrote the legislation, was behind a lot of that. He wrote an opinion piece in 2010, looking back over 40 years of the Clean Water Act, and said back in 1970, our biggest issue were point source. We had rivers on fire, we had industrial waste, we had, we had wastewater effluent that was terrible, and that's 85% of that pie chart there. So most of our impairments were from that. He makes a point. If you fast forward 40 years, we've spent a lot of time focusing on wastewater, traditional point source pollution, and the rest of the piece, the 85%, is now urban runoff and non-point. So the biggest problem that we have today in terms of impairment, percentage-wise, is exactly the opposite of where we were before. So this means that this is the water quality issue of our time in the 21st century. Just to give just basic context, this is not about the history of the Clean Water Act, but there's about 7,500 communities that have separated stormwater systems. So this is the MS4s. These are drainage systems that don't convey sanitary. So this is drainage systems basically, and you can see a map over there. And we've got about 770 or plus or minus of combined sewer systems that have combined sewer overflows in the country. A lot of it's in concentrated in the Midwest, up the Ohio area and Illinois, but also in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic here in the Mid-Atlantic, with some spots around. And that's again where you've got a surcharge of both sanitary flows and wet weather. So when it rains, it just overflows. These systems actually were designed to overflow. As you can see in the bottom lower left-hand corner there, because it took pressure off these systems. Of course, as we have more urbanization, we've got more flows, we've got climate change, we've got more flows and flashier and higher intensity storms. So we're having more and more overflows. So this is an issue as well. Just again, this is not history of the Clean Water Act, but the point here is that stormwater runoff was not, especially urban runoff, was not part of the initial Clean Water Act back in 1972. In fact, it was added later, 1987, part of the Clean Water Act amendments. And so that was first implemented in 1990, and then with about 600 or so large communities. Then the second phase of this brought in about another order of magnitude more, 6,500 or so. So we now have close to 7,500 MS4s. And again, the CSO control policy came up in 1994. So that was part of this evolution. The point here is that it's very young compared to the drinking water and wastewater sector. And back in 1969, we had rivers on fire, compelling problem, clearly. The question is runoff from a parking lot a compelling problem? I would say yes. I'm trying to make the case that that's the case, that's the situation, but it's a challenge, especially when, if I could write up the point that we have a lot of needs in the infrastructure sector, and we've greatly reduced our investments overall. So it's hard to make this case sometimes. So some things to consider with climate change, precipitation. We have these events now called cloudbursts. These are areas of heavy intense precipitation. Actually, it's been defined by the World Meteorological Organization. These are very small areas that get huge amounts of rain in a short amount of time. These are often missed by gauging stations, rainfall gauging stations, because they're so localized. but we're seeing an increase of the frequency of these and the intensity of these. And a lot of it's driven by the urban heat island effect that we see in our urban areas, where we have lots more heat. That heat air rises, the higher rises, and it cools, and you have a lot of these convective storms that pop up very quickly in local areas. Copenhagen experienced this, and they've been addressing this. This even happened here in Allentown, Pennsylvania, back in 2012. 12 inches of rain in a short amount of time. It absolutely decimated parts of Allentown. You didn't hear that much about it because it's such a localized thing, but we're seeing more and more of these dynamics coming up. If you want to look across the country, you can see we're already seeing the changes in high precipitation and high intensity storms, especially in the New England states, the Mid-Atlantic, the upper Midwest. So we're seeing changes already taking place. We're going to see more. So again, climate change is a driver here, and you can see that this shows the billion-dollar disaster events over time when you adjust for CPI there. And you can see from 1980 to 2016, we're seeing an increase overall in the impact. So flooding is the most impactful disaster in the US, and we're seeing more and more of that happening. Here's some examples for those in the DC area. We had 2 rain events that were 500-year events, so very rare events that happened within 2 years. One might have been even a 1,000-year rain event. High intensity. Each one of these events, this is in Ellicott City, Maryland, each one of these events had a fatality associated with it. And you can see on that map on the bottom of your screen, we had intensities of 6 to 7 inches of rain per hour in certain areas, washed out the portions of this entire town. This is happening in places like Michigan. We just had a huge dam burst in Michigan, similar type of damage that's taken place. So this is not just something that's taking place in the Mid-Atlantic here. We talked about nutrients. This is probably one of the most ubiquitous water quality issues. We're seeing that hypoxia, the dead zone, that's developed in the Gulf of Mexico and is growing. It's at the size of Connecticut or so, even though we've spent billions of dollars to try to address it. We were now seeing toxic algae in places like Hopatcong in Florida, and the red tide that comes up. This is algae that if you're just near it, just in the air that comes off of these waters, can create a rash. So we're seeing toxic algae, and we're seeing this in places like in the Great Lakes. We're seeing this. We're actually seeing it even in Utah Lake, and then China's seeing a bunch of this too. So there's a lot of impacts from nutrients around the country, and these have their economic impacts, as Colton mentioned. So tons of other water quality issues associated with urban runoff. I don't have time to cover all of this, but there's a lot. That's the point. So how have we dealt with this in the past? We've been Romans, basically. We've generated runoff, we've captured it, we collect it, we convey it through pipes, and then sometimes we hold it to try to reduce flooding for the most part. But now today we're using green infrastructure to infiltrate, retain, and try to green things up. And the point here is that we're seeing stormwater as being seen as more of a resource and more of as an opportunity rather than a burden. So this is something that we look at investments in. So I do want to talk about funding needs, since we're talking about this funding and financing. I wanted to mention the EPA Clean Watershed Needs Survey. It takes place every 4 years. Well, it's supposed to take place every 4 years. It's not been the case recently, but the last time we had information from EPA on this, we have an estimated $150 billion and this is needs, not a funding gap, in the stormwater and wet weather. So this is both urban runoff as well as combined sewer overflows. So that's $150 billion over the next 20 years. The Water Environment Federation and my organization, NAMSA, work together to do a survey of the needs assessment in the MS4 sector, and looking at the funding gap. And we have an annual funding gap estimate of about between 7.5 and $8 billion. Both these years we've done this. So we're seeing consistent challenges there, or consistent numbers that highlight this challenge that we're having. My organization also developed a kind of a shovel ready or ready to go project list that we prepared for in anticipation of a economic stimulus package, and that has not happened yet. But just we had for about 3 weeks, we had this this effort moving forward. Just in that small amount of time, we identified $1.3 billion in stormwater projects ready to go right now, if there was just funding available. So that highlights the need for funding out there. There are federal funding and financing programs out there. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund is one that's most notable, but only less than 5%, it's really less than 3% of this funding has ever gone to stormwater projects. So there's a challenge there. And in the another program is the Water Infrastructure Finance Innovation Act, WIFIA, which was modeled after TIFIA, the transportation version. This is basically federal financing through Treasury, the Treasury Department. And but we've seen this is moving forward. It's really done a lot of work. There's been about 40 projects financed, only 3 that have any kind of stormwater component to it. So it's, again, a small amount, 8%, 9%. We've got the 319 program that really focuses on the ag sector. That's another program. So there's not something really for this urban runoff program. So we've been working in legislation to get the sewer overflow and stormwater grants program. This is something that's proposed as part of WRDA 2020. But we think that's a lot of it's focused on wastewater and CSO issues. We need something for the small and medium-sized communities that in the MS4 sector. That's our view. So just to wrap things up on this, most funding, 95% of funding comes from local sources, usually having some kind of utility. In the stormwater sector, only about 25% of communities that are regulated actually have a stormwater utility and dedicated funding. That limits their ability to finance. And it's even when you have a utility set up, it's underfunded most often. And also you have federal dollars that come in, and it's always for capital, not for O&M. And that's a challenge because we need a lot of O&M funding, and that comes from the local area. So that's a challenge in our sector. And I'll just want to highlight what's happened in the past with the wastewater. This shows the different types of wastewater discharges and over time. And we could see that in 1972 and before, we had a significant amount of raw discharges, raw sewage. After 1972, we had, or into 1978 and beyond, we had a diminishment and almost no raw discharges. Why did that happen? It's because we invested in this infrastructure, and we could do the same thing for the stormwater sector if we had another significant amount of investment. I'm going to skip ahead, and I'm going to talk about something called a community-based public-private partnership, so I can wrap up so we can have time for Q&A. I'm just going to skip ahead to basically what this approach is. And this approach is, you can see it's right here. Rather than having the traditional way of procuring services for stormwater, which is similar to in other sectors, which is design, bid, build. You design something, a bid goes out for a contract or a consultant to design infrastructure. Then that another bid occurs, and then construction occurs after based upon that bid. What we're talking about here is having a municipality and a private entity come together. It's not a traditional P3 approach at all. It's more of a performance-based contract. They work together into a new entity that's called the CBP3 entity. They work together to do design, build, and operate, maintain all together. There's a lot of benefits to this. We're already seeing this implemented here in the Washington, D.C. area. In Prince George's County, we're seeing this. Chester, the city of Chester in Pennsylvania has adopted this, and that's a city that's literally bankrupt. They're using investment in green infrastructure as a way to revitalize their city. I don't have time to go over all of this, but this is a new and emerging approach that I would ask you guys to consider and check out. And there's information here about all the places where this is happening. Just don't have time to go over all this today. So I just want to talk about the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance. I'm not going to go over all of this again, but I just wanted to highlight this is the group that I lead. This is a coalition of state organizations because most programs for stormwater are at the state level. We have 22 states that are in 9 of the 10 EPA regions, and we're in discussions with several more with a little plus sign or those other states that we're trying to bring into it. So this is the first time we'll have a whole coalition of states representing the MS4s, really those separate storm sewer systems that have significant needs on many levels. We're about to have half the country covered. We also have affiliate members, which are like corporate sponsors and others too. So that's where that's the organization I'm coming from and represent. This is our leadership. We've got folks from California, Tennessee, Minnesota, and I'm the executive director there. I did want to highlight, Alfaka, you talked about the infrastructure report card. I wanted to highlight that this comes out every 4 years. You talked about the 2017 numbers. In 2021, it's coming out in March. And we've been working with ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers, to include stormwater. And for the very first time, because we've got drinking water and we have wastewater, we've got water resources and inland waters and flood control, those kind of things. We don't have local stormwater management systems and programs in place. For the first time ever, they're going to include in 2021 stormwater as a separate category. So this is a big deal, and it really helps us articulate a lot of the needs that we need across the country. And I also wanted to mention that we set up this community-based public-private partnership, a center of excellence. There's the information is there on that. More I could say about all of this. Last thing I wanted to say when I wrap up is that so far, up to this point, this is like, the kids table and the adults table that you see often in like Thanksgiving. I was thinking about this at Thanksgiving time. Often, stormwater's been the little kids table for a long time. And, because we've been kind of we're the new kid on the block, we're the troublemaker, and everyone else is at the big table. Now we're making our move. We're finally growing up. And that's one of the big takeaways here. So with that, I'll wrap up. I apologize, I went a little bit over, but I was trying to make up for time though, since we were crunched. So.
No problem. Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Hopatcong. This is all great. We could keep going for hours, I'm sure. There's a lot of interesting information to cover.
I'm going to stop my share so you can have it, Colton, all right?
All right, great. Thanks. All right, so yeah, we're going to open up to questions. We've got a few lined up here, but just remind everyone, if you have a question, please go ahead, put it in the Q&A box. Should be either at the bottom or the top of your Zoom client, just says Q&A. So we'll start with Erican. The question for Hopatcong is the bank already fully funded? Oh, we can't hear you. Let's see.
Yeah, there we go.
There we go.
Okay, this is a great question. What it needs, it has, in its design, it is fully funded to be independent of the federal budget. But to actually enact itself, to come into being, it needs the following. It needs first for the bill to create the bank, HR 6422, to be passed. And that will create the institution, which is this public bank. The second thing that it needs is to become capitalized in the way that I described on the flow chart. And we think that that can happen rather quickly. But the third thing is, how long would it take? We know infrastructure to be well developed takes long-term planning, and you need to integrate a lot of things. For example, water infrastructure where you're replacing pipes needs to be integrated with the transportation sector, because you're putting these pipes and other utilities underneath the roads, and you need to coordinate all that. Could take some time. Then there could be also complicated projects, very complicated transportation projects to even out transportation, insert some more rail in the mix, redevelop rail lines in cities where land is at a premium cost. And those kinds of things can be complicated and take years to go forward. But what we're developing right now for our National Infrastructure Bank is a plan for those projects that are shovel ready that we can do in year one. And hopefully they'll be they'll be able to use low skilled laborers until those laborers are able to be trained in the technical trades in order to do more complicated infrastructure investment. So I'm so excited to listen to Seth's presentation on all these areas where there are essentially shovel-ready stormwater projects ready to go. I'm really excited to talk with him later on about this, this list. We want to, in the first year, put as many people to work doing infrastructure projects as we can. We're even anticipating having a sort of a skeleton crew bank to do the operations during year one until we can get the bank settled as an institution and have all of its designs and procedures and everything sort of fleshed out, and then take on complicated projects. But in year one, we're really looking for water projects, since water is so critical and it's the second largest infrastructure need after transportation. So we want to see if we can get these banks moving along, these projects.
Great, thank you. So the next question is.
Hey, Colton, can I add a little bit to it?
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Just want to add two quick things. I know we got short on time.
Go for it.
The first thing is on as far as jobs are concerned, you're absolutely right, Alfeka. One of the great things about stormwater and green infrastructure is that it creates local green jobs, and that's really what we need. These are jobs that can't be sent somewhere else. These are not, most of these jobs are not highly technical. So this is really an entry-level workforce development. And that's when we talk about the community-based P3 program approach, that's really what it's about. It's requiring local workforce to be used in communities. So investment has to be made there. And again, it's also trying to support local workforce targets and development, as well as local businesses and small business creation, all that good stuff. So stormwater is one of those sectors where we can really make a huge dent in workforce. And I just wanted to make sure that that's it. And then on the transportation side, about 20 to 30% of transportation projects have some kind of stormwater management section to it. People think about transportation as transportation. It's huge, and it's true. But there's a significant portion of that really it goes towards stormwater management. So if we're talking about investing in transportation, that's also by way, cleaning our water as well. And it's not thought of that way, but I wanted to highlight that so that we can make that linkage as well. That was it. Sorry, Colton.
No, great, thanks. And actually, well, that leads into another question. Unless Alfeka, did you have something to add to that, or?
No, that's good.
Okay, great. Just making sure. So is there a platform for small and medium enterprises and landowners to connect to deal with stormwater at local, regional levels? Many small and medium enterprises have solutions, but have difficulty making approach to stormwater management, approaching stormwater management managers for projects.
Yeah, so just real quickly, that is a challenge. There's there's a lot of competition for consultants and contractors in the stormwater world, just like there is in other infrastructure sectors. One of the challenges that you see oftentimes for small businesses and minority-owned businesses is just experience, knowing how to go after work, knowing how to just run a business and those type of things. That it's just a challenge, right? And I think this is answering the question. If I'm off, Colton, just cut me off so I make sure that I'm not off base. But for local small businesses, that is a challenge. And I have my own small business. I understand those challenges. Mm-hmm. I talked about the community-based public-private partnership approach. Again, don't think of it as a P3. Just think of it as kind of a smarter way of doing more work and generating local benefits. In that, in these programs, there's a requirement to support a certain specific number of local businesses, small businesses, minority-owned businesses, so you can grow industries within communities to help get over these challenges. So for instance, if I'm a contractor, I'm a minority-owned business, and I don't know how to go after work in a community, this entity, this public-private entity, will actually work with, kind of mentor to these companies to learn, so they can learn how to get work in this program, because the more the better, more competition the better, and the more work overall there's going to be more need for additional and multiple companies out there. Another something that has come up in the past too is it's hard to get bonding if you're a contractor. So in these CBP3 programs, they can waive bonding requirements, or they can do bonding for a select number of small minority-owned businesses. So there's other ways that we can overcome this, but that is really tough to start some of these small businesses. And the CBP3 approach recognizes this and has been trying to address it. So that's really getting at that specific challenge. I don't know if that addressed it, Colton, but I'll check in that.
Oh yeah, I think it did. And that question was from David Benjamin. And David, if you have follow-up question please go ahead and put it in the chat or in the Q&A box. So we are at the top of the hour here. We could continue going if our panelists are willing and able to keep it going a few more minutes, because we got a few more questions. And so for everyone that's okay, yeah, and just let me know if you need to drop off. So yeah, we'll continue going. And just in case for the attendees that are leaving now, if you want our contact information, it's up there on the screen. So let's move ahead with the next question for Alfeka. Do you think the Biden administration will support the National Infrastructure Bank? How quickly can we get this going?
That's also a great question. Actually, our coalition, our grassroots coalition, has been really, really working on this to try to see if we can. We've already made contact with the Biden transition team. They actually sent out invitations to the public to have the public give them comments on things that are needed. So we took the opportunity to let them know about this bank, and so we've talked with part of the transition team that's overseeing the U.S. Department of Commerce, and we hope to have some more meetings with transportation people and economists as well. But honestly, we see this, this is a great opportunity. We see this National Infrastructure Bank proposal as potentially a centerpiece for the Biden administration, which has now got its hands, it made a lot of promises during the campaign to have more green investments, to rebuild infrastructure, to put people back to work, to solve the economic problems. And this bank is the one way that is fully funded to address all of those needs. So we're working now to continue our contacts with the team and to introduce them. And we're asking other people who know people on the transition team, for example, city council persons and county council persons and state county persons who have infrastructure needs in their area. They're not getting them financed, and they see this as a way to get their projects financed. So we really got a big effort out there, and we really also have a big, since we know that the economy is in crisis mode, we have millions of people who are unemployed. We've had something of a K-shaped recovery, which has helped people in the top income ends, but not the people in the bottom income ends. And those are exactly the very people that we want to put back to work into great paying jobs. So the faster that we get the bank off of the starting line on day one and fund all of these shovel-ready projects, including for water, the faster that we can make huge improvements into the economy. So that's our game plan.
Glad you're hopeful. So another question here. Well, this is actually just a quick one for Seth. Is a cloudburst similar to an atmospheric river? Kind of a technical question.
Yeah, no, just real quickly. I'm not a specialist in those areas. I mean, as far as atmospheric river, but I think my understanding is atmospheric river is when you have a large system that sets up for a long period of time, and you get rain, storm after storm after storm. So you just get a lot of rain over a couple of weeks or something like that. Whereas a cloudburst is literally something that happens within an hour or even 45 minutes. So that's one is very, very localized. Like I talked about Allentown, Pennsylvania. They had they have a large what is it, like a county fair area where they've got a large asphalt area where it is like maybe 3 or 4 square blocks, something like that. I mean, it was that condensed, and they had a ton of rain in that area. Cars were floating away. There were businesses flooded out, but in a very localized way. An atmospheric river is a much larger and longer event. That's my understanding, but I'm not a meteorologist, so I'll just be the first to admit that.
Yeah, that's much better than I would do. Great. So we have 2 more questions, actually both aimed towards me. One from American. What's an example of how this affects financial services? This was the case I was talking about in Lake Hopatcong, New Jersey. And I was just trying to give a good indication of, how businesses beyond and industries and sectors beyond just those servicing the water-based tourism recreation can be affected. And the idea is basically, as these businesses like the boating companies and the hotels and the restaurants and so forth in the community are taking a serious hit from the decrease in amount of tourism to the community, the rest of the companies that service those industries are also going to take a hit. And as those people working in the directly affected industries are losing income, laying off employees, they're spending less at other industries that aren't directly affected. And so therefore, any business within a community really is going to be affected, just some more than others. So financial services, there's going to be less loans. There's going to be less, actual use of banks and so forth. And they'll be affected less than other companies, but still could potentially be affected. The last one is for the Kiss the Ground question, or this question was from an anonymous attendee. They're asking if we had seen the film Kiss the Ground, and they're asking about farmers and addressing these sorts of issues with farmers and how federal agencies can work with them. And I think that's a big question. And actually, I know this person is anonymous, but I would point you to the American Sustainable Business Council's Regenerative Agriculture campaign. Just type it into Google. I work on that campaign as well. And we are working on these exact kind of issues. And we work with Kiss the Ground, actually. They're part of our working group we put together. So if you're interested, put your information in there and we'll reach out to you and get you involved. So that was the last question. Oh, wait, we actually have one more. This one is for Seth. Do you have time, Seth?
All yes, right. Sorry, I couldn't get to my unmute button quickly.
No,
I'm fine. Yeah.
Cool. Yep. All right. Yeah, this is great. I really think we could keep this going for hours, and I'm really glad we're not going to. Don't worry. But I think we have a lot to learn from each other, and hopefully can have a stronger partnership moving forward and really build off each other's work. But so this question is from Laura. So please explain what a CBP3 is, community-based public-private partnership. I saw that there is one located in Salinas, California, which, quick note, that's where my sister lives. I live near, and so Laura continues, I live near Salinas, and I like to understand better what that is. And Seth, I think you mentioned it already, but maybe you could briefly summarize it again, just maybe it wasn't clear for some people.
Yeah, it's one of these things that's complicated to discuss in detail, but and I try to go over that quickly. But I mean, the bottom line is this: that the traditional way of building infrastructure in the stormwater sector, and this is true of, I think, again, a lot of other infrastructure sectors, is what's called the design, bid, build approach, which is, again, separated services. There's a designer, there's a builder, and there's competitions or bidding, what's called, for services in each one of these areas. And so that's one aspect of what we're trying to change, is trying to look at ways that we can integrate services together. That reduces what's called frictional costs. Every time you go out to bid, there's always a cost of doing business, and that increases cost. So this is CBP3 is trying to address some of the challenges in both the cost of project delivery for stormwater management, as well as the speed and the pace and the scale of it. So again, this is looking at the way to integrate services. But the other thing that's challenging about stormwater compared to either transportation or hospitals or or wastewater treatment plant is those are large single projects oftentimes. Stormwater facilities, especially green infrastructure, are small, they're micro. So instead of having one treatment plant in a community, where you would have one wastewater treatment plant, you might have literally hundreds or thousands of small green infrastructure practices. And having to go through this design, bid, build process for each one of these projects in a separate way is death by a thousand cuts. It creates those small, maybe additional 10% cost. Something adds up when you do this over and over and over again. So this is looking at something called project bundling, where you take hundreds or thousands of these projects together all at one time. So that's another facet of this, is we're trying to address distributed infrastructure, which is different than traditional infrastructure implementation for larger singles. So this is another way that, this is looking at a larger programmatic view. So instead of doing one, you do hundreds or thousands even. And another area that this changes things is that there's a fixed fee. That's kind of the same thing that you think about with P3s, is that a private entity comes involved. And this is not about financing, by the way. Oftentimes we think about traditional P3s with like highways, toll roads, things like that. And that requires private financing, and that's at 10% or 12% or some pretty high rate of return. This community-based P3 approach is agnostic for funding and financing. And in fact, the best thing to use is what's the best deal for the community, because we don't want to burden communities with higher debt than they need to have. And there's WIFIA and there's SRF programs, and these are at market or sub-market rates. So these are really, it's really cheap money, really cheap financing. And we don't get a chance to take advantage of that in the stormwater sector. So this is a way to scale up and be able to actually do financing in this context. And hopefully the national, if we get an infrastructure bank, that'd be awesome too. Because so this is not something that competes with that. This is something that would actually benefit from having a bank like that available. And we need to get to bigger scale. So CBP3 allows us to go to a larger scale, which we haven't been able to do in stormwater. The last thing I'll mention is it's called community-based, and it starts with community-based in its title because there are requirements. You can't get paid as the private entity doing all this work. You can't get paid unless you meet social and economic targets. That means you have to use a specified percentage of local workers. You have to use a specified amount of your contract has to go to local, small, minority-owned businesses, as an example. You don't get full payment until that happens. And that's not a secondary thing, that's a primary goal and objective. So that's why this is community-based. I could go on, but that's oh, and Salinas, I'll just mention, we're working with Salinas now to develop this. They're not fully developed yet, but they're on their way. So it takes a little bit of time to get there. But Salinas is a good example of a city that has a lot of needs. And a lot of workforce needs, a lot of other needs, just like the city of Chester in Pennsylvania. So this is really something that's targeted for communities that have the greatest need for support.
Great, thanks. And Laura, she followed up to that. What was the name of that company, the CBP3 company in Salinas?
Yeah, I don't right now, as far as I know. So I've been working. I don't know if I think they have been selected. So they did a competition, which is what you have to do when you have these, which is good. This is what we have to do: transparent and competitively bid contracts. I think it was Corvius, the Corvius Group or Corvius Solutions that won that bid, and I believe they're working right now with Salinas to set up their community-based public-private partnership right now.
Great. And Laura has another follow-up, and Laura, I'm just going to encourage you to, Seth, if it's okay with you, recommend that she reach out to you if she has more questions.
Sure. Yep.
About this, yeah. All right. So we are now getting on 15 minutes over, and we could keep going, but I want to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you for all the attendees that are still there, sticking to it to the very end. And I hope we can continue this conversation moving forward. We have all of our contact information here. Check out all of our websites. We've mentioned them. You can just Google them. ASBC, we have our Clean Water is Good for Business campaign. You can sign up there, stay up to date on all of our work, and we are collaborating with both Seth and Alphecca and their organizations. And let's keep it moving forward and make some progress on getting some funding for much needed infrastructure and water infrastructure. So thank you. And yeah.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Alphecca. And thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And have a good rest of your day.
Okay. Thanks.